So we have an exciting keynote speaker who's come all the way from Montreal to inspire us. His name is James Hughes, and he's a lawyer by training, and according to his biography, previously worked as a corporate lawyer. But over the last decade, his career has focused on social issues and inclusion. In 2004 to 2008, James served as Director General of the Old Brewery Mission, and some of you may know that mission, Quebec's largest center serving homeless men and women. And from 2008 to 2011, he was New Brunswick's Deputy Minister of Social Development. During this time, he played a central role in the development and implementation of the province's trailblazing poverty reduction strategy. So James is currently the president of the Graham Beck Foundation, a leading philanthropic organization in the mental health sector. So this morning, he will share with us his experience in New Brunswick, mobilizing the nonprofit, business, and government sectors to collaborate on poverty reduction. So will you give James a warm welcome to Surrey and to this forum? Thank you so much for coming.
Well, thank you very much, Judy, for that fantastic introduction. I really appreciate it very much, and what a treat to be in Surrey, BC, in the Kwantlen territory. My first time here. I was very curious about the words the president of the university used in describing me from Montreal as some sort of exotic bird. So maybe I'm a parrot or something of that kind. But I do, having flown in here, I'm just so excited to be just a little bit of a part of something I think very special that's going on here in Surrey, BC, and in vibrant communities right across the country. And as Judy said in the introduction, I'm really here to tell you about the story of another poverty reduction narrative that occurred right at the other end of the country. But I want to start, if I may, by telling you a story that I heard in a presentation when I was at the Department of Social Development in New Brunswick by the leader of a nursing home, one of the bigger nursing homes in the province. Our department was responsible for everything from child protection all the way to seniors care. And needless to say, we were very involved in the aging file. And this lady came to the podium in a conference about the whole seniors file. And she told this story about this employee that she hired, someone who was a cleaner, a middle-aged lady who they hired, who had some fine references, and they needed, as all institutions do, someone to clean their facilities. And she was hired, and within a couple of weeks, she started getting reports that this person really wasn't measuring up. Seeing the evaluations, that really the rooms she was cleaning and so on were really not that clean. So she talked herself to the employee and said, what's going on? I'm getting these evaluations. There's an echo, eh? When I speak, I can hear it. Is it better if I speak back here? Is this a little better? Okay. So what she said is what's happening, and the lady said, well, I'm cleaning. I'm working hard. I'm working all day. I think I'm delivering a really good, clean product. And she said, well, okay. Well, listen, we really got to make sure you clean those rooms. So anyway, needless to say, nothing changed. So it was very interesting what happened. So the executive director of this big nursing home, big organization, said, I want to come with you and just see what you're doing. So they went into a few rooms that she had just cleaned, and she said, well, what about that corner? You didn't take care of that corner. What about that bathtub? You didn't kind of finish up the bathtub. She said, well, it's clean. That's exactly what my personal experience was. So the executive director said, okay, you know what we're going to do tomorrow? I'm going to come with you. We're going to do a real clean tomorrow. And the next day, this executive director took all day, spent the whole shift with this staff person. And they cleaned the rooms and the hallways that she was responsible for in the way that the executive director expected and required. Every corner was clean. Every counter was polished. Every wall was wiped down. And at the end of the day, the staff member said to the executive director, "I had no idea this is what you expected. I had no idea this is what clean meant." So from then on, that staff member became the best cleaner in that nursing home. An example for others. So here's why I'm telling you that story. Sometimes the words aren't enough. You've got to see it. You've got to see what it means to be clean in this case. So for poverty reduction plans, what does it look like when a community is actually starting to reduce poverty? What does it actually look like? And how powerful can those images be as you start to think about reducing poverty, not just in yours, but in communities right across the province? What is the picture of poverty reduction? For me, I'm just going to throw a few of these up here for you. You'll have others. You can add many more. The picture of poverty reduction is schools like this one in New Brunswick, which are full of bikes, kids coming to schools, active, engaged. It's people who can get around, not just a few people, but all people who can get around to the places they need to go, to be engaged and included in their communities. It's about housing development, community engagement through the development of the kind of places that we want, not just that we talk about. It's about community gardens. It's about growing together. This is a YouthWorks initiative in Baltimore. Young people learning the trade of housing. This is a growing place, Surrey. BC is on the coast here, is just exploding. How many young people are involved in that who are on the margins, not necessarily having the kind of skill sets they need? They should be part of this. This, by the way, is a fantastic brand. I don't know who came up with this, but this is brilliant. You could do so much with that. Yeah, round of applause for that. So when you're getting trained, you have the chance to be part of the economy. And if you're getting trained in those areas that also touch housing and community development, you're killing two birds, not just one. Think about those kind of pictures. Of course, it's about early education. Poverty is about all the things you're dreaming of. It's about transportation and housing and income and education and training. Those are the pictures of poverty reduction, folks. That's when it's working. And it's not just a few people that you want to see in those pictures. You want everyone to have access to those things. Starting to share the yearning for the changes that create those images are what you're ultimately trying to do. Let me add to the lovely kind of messaging you're sending out. Ultimately, you're trying to get from this to that, right? To those kinds of pictures. And I want to now tell you a little bit about the picture of poverty reduction in New Brunswick and what we did there, and hopefully that'll serve to help think through what the next steps you may be considering along the way to poverty reduction here in Surrey and across the province. But first, here's what you've decided to take on, something exceptionally complex. Exceptionally complex. This is not about cancer care. This is not about a specific social issue such as building a nursing home, to use my previous analogy. This is about the connectivity between layers of government. But where does it hit the ground? As the president said, it's thinking globally but acting locally. I actually never really liked that phrase. I've actually always thought about acting globally, acting federally, and acting locally. The thinking is good, but the action is where it's key. But it's funny how Sherry Torsman ends her description about collaboration with communities. You might as well substitute Surrey there. Working in collaboration with Surrey. And that's really what this is all about. I mean, I've read this plan. This is a good plan. This is solid. It's ambitious. It reaches to where it has to reach to, which is not just within, but reaching up to provincial and federal levels. We're going to talk about that a little bit more. But ultimately, that is not easy business. It's complex. Okay, so 2008, New Brunswick. There's a Liberal government in place, and it is getting beaten up by a couple of organizations in the province who are demanding a poverty reduction plan. And it was the Business Community Anti-Poverty Initiative in St. John, and it was the Common Front in Moncton, who were in the papers all the time saying, poverty reduction plan, let's get organized to reduce poverty. Let's not just hope it happens. That was factor number one, outside pressure on the provincial government. Factor number two was that Ontario, Quebec, and Newfoundland had already started off on poverty reduction initiatives. And that's what provinces do. They look over their shoulder a lot. What are the other guys and gals doing? That was factor number two in putting pressure on the provincial government to take a leadership role. Factor number three was that there was an internal champion who wanted this to happen. My minister at the time, Mary Scryer, an absolutely incredible woman of the kind I think we've seen in Judy Villeneuve, said we need a poverty reduction plan, and politicians have, and we have some politicians in the room, this much political capital. They don't have this much. They have to spend it wisely. And she decided to spend hers on trying to convince her cabinet colleagues that a poverty reduction plan was important for the province, and she succeeded. One of the ways she succeeded was by the argument that we don't have to take it all on ourselves. This poverty reduction is not just about the province. It's also about the nonprofit communities doing their share. It's also about the business community doing their share. Is there a way we could kind of share the weight? And what was birthed was ultimately a plan which sat on the shoulders of all three of those sectors. And we called it Overcoming Poverty Together, OPT, OPT. And over the course of 2008-2009, here's what happened. A dialogue session, kind of like what I think is going on here in Surrey, took place. 2,500 New Brunswickers, that's a lot of New Brunswickers. New Brunswick is not a big place. We're involved in a dialogue on two questions. What is poverty? Because a lot of people think of it differently, and how can we solve it? And all this raw material from right across the province was put together into basically a binder and given to a second phase of the process. We call that the roundtable phase. And at the roundtable phase, people from the business community, from the nonprofit community, people living in poverty, as well as government officials, sat together for 8 days, and they came up with what we called options for poverty reduction. So this is interesting. What we did was we relied upon the National Council of Welfare's report called Solving Poverty, which looked at poverty reduction plans right across the world. And they distilled 4 main factors that successful poverty reduction strategies had. 1, a timeline and a target. 2, priority actions. 3, metrics. How are we going to measure success? And 4, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, who's going to deliver it? Who's responsible? So at this second phase, this expert group really took all of that raw material from the first phase and divided it up into basically options in those 4 different categories. and produced a report which was submitted to a final forum. So 50 people, leaders from all the sectors I just mentioned, in a room together for 2 days, chaired by the Premier, and they took basically that menu of options and they decided upon a poverty reduction plan for the province. Not the cabinet. The cabinet had already spent about 8 hours, I can tell you that, preparing for the final forum, this body outside of government, because it wanted to be part of what was essentially a negotiation. Something that they could say yes to. So over the course of those 2 days, this negotiation led to the adoption of a plan for poverty reduction in the province, of which the province would participate but would not own. It would play its part. That was really a key factor to making sure government would not be hoisted up and flailed for failing. Because that's what politicians are scared of. This is why politicians who I've spent a lot of time with don't necessarily want to get engaged in poverty reduction types of plans, because setting those targets, setting those timelines is basically setting them up for being the target of failure. Because these things are hard to do. As I said, very complex stuff. A lot of it out of your hands. So you're not necessarily going to achieve those successes. So how can you deal with that? Surrey, you guys are going to have to deal with that issue. That's a very important issue to deal with, because you are dealing in the realm of politics. This is politics, folks. Not necessarily partisan politics, and we'll actually talk a little bit about that too. But this is political. It was an amazing thing, if I just may. Like this final forum, these final days, when you're actually sitting there, you're actually seeing the politicians and the leaders of business. You've heard of the Irving family. J.K. Irving himself was sitting at the table. Across the table were 3 ladies who were on social assistance. Brilliant people who had been identified through the poverty reduction plan itself. And watching them negotiating what the minimum wage should be. Watching them negotiating, well, how should we reform social assistance? Because I want to keep my health card if I'm going to go work. I can't go and work without a health card. I got to stay on social assistance if I'm going to lose access to prescription drugs. And talking about those issues in an authentic place. Not a place over there that the politicians are deciding, that a place that actually engages the people who are themselves affected by these policies. And ultimately, they found, as we say in French, un terrain d'entente. They found a consensus. They found a place because the process led them there, and they wanted to achieve something together. Well, that was in 2009. That was one of the best days of my life, I would say. Honestly, God, like November 2009, being part of that, being a witness of that, actually having supported that process, because that's what our instructions were at the department, was to really help drive that process through to conclusion. Seeing them come to those conclusions, what I'll tell you a little bit more about what they were, really quite magnificent. It really was. So, overcoming poverty together is actually the translation of ensemble, it's beautiful in French, ensemble pour vaincre la pauvreté. It's a bilingual province, and actually it was the French name that came first, and this was the translation. So, in fact, it was going to be Together Overcoming Poverty, TOP, but people thought maybe TOP wasn't quite necessary. It might have been over the top, so preferred OPT as the title. And they didn't give themselves 122 actions to deal with. They gave themselves 22 priority actions in 3 areas. Those 3 areas were basically basic assistance. So what the drafters called opportunities for being. So that's the stuff like, how do you get through the day? Enough income to get through the day. Making sure you have a home to go to, that you can lock the door and others can't come in. That there was opportunities for becoming. That's that whole piece about education and training and early learning. And then the final part was opportunities for belonging. That's where we had community development, social enterprise, and other types of initiatives like that. The objective was reducing poverty by 50% within 5 years and deep income poverty by deep income poverty, by 50% within that time, and income poverty by 25%. That's the targets we gave ourselves. The priority actions, as I say, were 22 across those 3 areas. The metrics we used were mostly the market basket type measures, and we won't get into that, but it's basically market basket. And then the delivery piece was probably the most interesting piece of all. At the final forum, it was decided that we needed a body that could be accountable for implementing it, but included everybody. So it couldn't be the government department doing it, and it couldn't be a nonprofit agency doing it. So what was decided, and I think this is an interesting precedent for you to consider as you start to think about that accountability piece, is a Crown corporation. So what the government did was enact a law, unanimously passed, called the Economic and Social Inclusion Act. It's interesting, they decided not to call it the Poverty Reduction Act. I'm just thinking of the images we had at the beginning. They talked about economic and social inclusion. That was actually the name of the legislation. And that legislation created a Crown corporation called the Economic and Social Inclusion Corporation, which government undertook to fund, which itself would have a board of directors, individuals named by order in council, who would be from the sectors I just mentioned before, in equal numbers. So you'd have 4 representatives of government. In fact, it turned out to be 4 ministers of the Crown. There would be 4 people from the business community, 4 people from the nonprofit community, and 4 people with a lived experience in poverty. Those 16 people would guide and be responsible for the poverty reduction plan. So government could say they were involved, but they were not in it alone. They were all going to bear the weight together. Another really interesting aspect on the delivery side was, what role do communities play? So right across that first phase of poverty reduction in New Brunswick, communities were saying, well, what about us? Like, we know the people who are poor here in Dalhousie, or here in Rishabuktu, or up in Tracadie, these corners of the province. What role can we play? And so the Act, the Economic and Social Inclusion Act, what it created were community inclusion networks. So it divided the province up into 12 by regulation. This is law, and each of those 12 communities would themselves have to develop their local plan consistent with overcoming poverty together, consistent with the provincial framework. And through the Crown Corporation, resources would flow, not tons of resources, but some resources would flow provincially down to the communities so that they could actually start to harness all of the strengths, local business, nonprofit organizations, and others, to build a local response adapted to their needs right there on the ground. So those community inclusion networks was a very interesting and integrated way to make sure that on the ground, in the diverse places of the province, individuals could be engaged in a provincial effort. There were some other really big issues that poverty reduction took on as well. And the way they decided to take them on was through the creation of advisory committees of the Crown Corporation. I won't go into this too much, but prescription drugs, the issue I mentioned. So New Brunswick still doesn't, to this day actually, unfortunately, have a prescription drug plan for all New Brunswickers. Over 200,000 didn't have access to a plan. So that's big money and big policy. So an advisory committee was created to try to come up with recommendations to government in that regard. Social assistance reform, wickedly difficult issue as well, was also submitted to a subcommittee for work, as was social enterprise, and how we can actually overcome that divide between nonprofit and for-profit enterprise to try to find ways to achieve common good through market mechanisms. And here's some of the results that are starting to come out now. So we'll get into the 4 years later. Healthy smiles and clear vision. So every kid in the province now has access to a dental plan and access to glasses if they need them. notwithstanding their income. Every kid who needs it gets it. It wasn't expensive actually either when you actually broke it out and looked at it on an insurance basis. Not hard to do. You can't get through school if you can't read, because you can't see the page. And we know what dental care means for kids trying to get through school and get into adulthood. That smile is so important for so much. Social assistance reform actually took a great big first step. Won't get into the details of that, but it really did get off the ground. A drug plan for uninsured New Brunswickers is on the way. It's been announced in the throne speech, actually, which was Monday, so it hopefully will come into play just before the provincial election next year. Funny about that timing. And there was many other successes as well. But at the community level, things got really rocking. The place is still rocking. 110 projects launched, citizens engaged in the thousands. The smallish money, the several millions of dollars that were flown or driven through the Crown Corporation down to communities, leveraged all kinds of other resources as well. The way it works is that the ones in green are provinces with poverty reduction strategies accompanied by targets. The ones in yellow are provinces with poverty reduction strategies which don't have targets, kind of open-ended type of plans. And the ones in red are those with no poverty reduction strategies at all as of 2011. So this is not to show off, but you may see that there is one province in green that has done particularly well over this time. And in their summary of an analysis of these initiatives across the province, the organization which produced this, which is Daily Bread in Toronto, said this, is that poverty reduction strategies with firm targets and timelines, dedicated resources, are the ones that are reducing poverty the most. Maybe that's just, that's intuitive. Maybe that didn't need to be said. But I think it does need to be said. The provinces where there are plans are doing better than the provinces without plans. And the provinces which have firm targets and have dedicated resources are doing better than those that don't. There is an outlier, Saskatchewan. Just want to raise that. Saskatchewan is doing okay. Their economy has done pretty well over the last little while, though. And it's largely related to that. They actually have an internal poverty reduction plan. I say internal because it's government only. There was no process, there's no targets, there's no community engagement. They call it From Dependence to Independence. It's basically putting together in one plan everything they're doing in the area of poverty reduction, social assistance, social reform, and so on. And they are achieving some good results. There's no question about that. But there's a lot of people in Saskatchewan that are being left on the sidelines too. And by the way, that's true in New Brunswick as well. These are trends. This is going in the right direction. But even our plan, we have not achieved our objectives. You remember what our objectives were off the top: 25% reduction on NBM. We haven't done it. But thank God we shot for it. Thank God we went for it, or else we wouldn't even got this far. And the big road is really ahead. It's always ahead to a certain degree, but you got to start. You got to start these things. So for the last few minutes I have, I really just want to talk about the recipe, and these are really the realities that we faced in New Brunswick, and how we, in many ways, overcame them, why we think there has been a modicum of success there, although not as much success as perhaps we would have liked given the numbers. So I can't stress enough how important it is to identify an agency, an organization, which is responsible. There will not be poverty reduction unless someone is tasked with making it happen. In New Brunswick, we had this Crown Corporation. You have to think about that here in BC as well. Surrey, it looks like you're getting organized for this. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but At the end of the day, if everybody's responsible, folks, no one's responsible. That's an iron law of politics. Someone's got to be made responsible for this, or else you're doing exactly what the picture says. You're pointing at others, okay? There's so many great examples of where, you know, making someone responsible, making an organization responsible actually achieves results, and not just in poverty reduction. There's a 90% reduction in car theft in Winnipeg. I'm not sure if you knew that. Why? Because the city created a special car theft unit to make sure they identify who's stealing the cars, go after them relentlessly. Well, what do you know? Car theft went down. They found the bad guys. They jailed the bad guys. It worked. They focused on it. In Montreal, you might be hearing that we have a little bit of corruption in the city administration. Not very exotic at all. Well, finally, starting to get a grip on it. How come? Despite years of being asked to create a special unit to track down the bad guys and bad girls, the Charest government finally created UPAC, which is the unit which was going after organized crime in the construction business, and lo and behold, all kinds of things started to happen. It's true in so many areas. You need to have a lead agency on this. Hopefully one which is inclusive and engaging, but someone's got to be responsible. You need new resources. With what you've got now, used in the way you're using them now, you will not reduce poverty. You need new resources to come from somewhere. There's two speeds in government. Did you know? You guys probably know that. There's glacial, and there's lightning fast. It's glacial when it comes from the bottom. You know what? Civil servants are amazing people. I used to work for a homeless shelter. And we used to throw things at civil servants all the time, right? You're not helping people who are homeless enough. You're not doing your share. But I tell you, having stepped into the civil service in New Brunswick, it's amazing how many well-meaning people who really want to make a difference. But they are working in a political context. They are driven by the priorities of their cabinet, their minister, and their premier. Some things can be done, but they usually take a lot of time if they come up from the bottom. It can move lightning fast when it comes from the top, though. When it's a premier or a minister saying, we want that done, guess how fast it gets done? Really fast. And even though budgets are allocated, resources are now fixed, there's usually resources to be used. There's usually additional resources to be had or resources that can be moved. When you've picked your priorities and this identifies those things, it's time to ask for the resources to get them done. Maybe not all of them at the same time, but pick your battles and go get the resources you need from the provincial level, and maybe from the city level as well. So in New Brunswick, this was interesting. So the Liberal government at the time dared to say, do we have to make this intensively partisan? Do we want to own this as a Liberal government? Do we want to campaign on this? Can we make political marks on this? And they said, you know what? This may be too important for that. So they sent their civil servants across to talk to the opposition caucus. And we said, can we treat poverty differently than we treat every other issue? And what do you know? The opposition said, sure. We want to be part of it. So those three phases that I mentioned in terms of the poverty reduction process, a member of the opposition appointed by the leader attended and participated. At the final forum, the leader of the opposition was there. The leader of the opposition, at the press conference following the successful adoption of OPT, sat with the premier and said, this is one of the most exciting initiatives I've ever been involved in. So that's why there was unanimous consensus at the adoption of the Economic and Social Inclusion Act in April of 2010, I guess, would have been the date. And guess what happened 4 months later? The government, a year and 4 months later, the government changed. The population threw out the Liberals and brought in the Conservatives. And guess what they did with the poverty reduction plan? Full steam ahead. They didn't stop because of this. Because they were engaged from the beginning, that they agreed to treat it differently. Ask yourselves if that would be possible here. Unusual suspects. So this is a bit of one of those X factors. So, and this is definitely also something for you to consider. I think there's two main unusual suspects that need to be brought part to these plans. The first is people living in poverty themselves. The authenticity and credibility that attach to a plan, as well as the additional insights that come from involving people who are living the barriers to getting into the mainstream economy, are remarkable. And it's hard work. It's hard work to find and engage in a sustained way people living in poverty. Have you done that? It's a rhetorical question, but ask yourself the question. Have you done that in Surrey? If you do, it will be a better plan. Okay? The other unusual suspect is the business community. Business community is probably the most powerful poverty reduction agent in this city and in this province. They are the ones who pay the wages. They are the ones who provide most of the benefits. They are the ones who create wealth, create jobs. Having leadership in the business community that puts up their hand and says, this is not right to have a 15.5% poverty reduction rate in my city, is very valuable, very powerful. And if you have a lot of them, even better. Working at the level of their own business to try to make their own business a poverty-free environment with living wages and so on, to be part of chambers of commerce who are also talking about being engaged in these processes, and then taking leadership roles in the kind of initiative that this represents. They also have access to another type of ally in government as well that maybe you don't, which are the ministers and the civil servants dealing on the economic side of the equation. Remember, poverty reduction is not just a social phenomenon, it's an economic one as well. In fact, there's no difference anymore, right? They fuse together, economic and social, to become one in terms of poverty reduction. You need them, they're two halves of a whole, and they need to be addressed as such. I love that picture. That's a dog, mouth on a stick, and he's not letting go. So you don't just have months of work ahead, you don't just have years of work ahead, you have literally decades of work ahead. And so developing the next generations of leadership in this file is crucial, because it's going to take that much time to move the numbers. You're going to be able to get some quick wins, maybe. Maybe you can get some quick wins that can really bring credibility to a plan, but the big gains are out there and down the street. I just have a couple of other comments. So in Alberta, there are 7 cities which came together on the homelessness file. So the senior leadership in the homelessness area, now this is big, so we're talking big business here, right? And these are big shelters with multi-million-dollar budgets. Organizations like the Calgary Homelessness Foundation, like Homeward Bound in in Edmonton. They all came together to say, you know what, we need the province to do much more on the homeless file than they are today. When those 7 cities came together and they created a body called the 7 Cities, they had an incredible new ability to talk to the province in a way they hadn't before. Together, they were significantly stronger than they were apart. And it has led to them being included formally in the homelessness policy development team at the ministry, and in terms of resource development in that file in the province. Very interesting potential precedent for you guys to consider. Surrey by itself will not be able to make the case, I put, to government that profound changes need to be made at the provincial level. What about Surrey with 6 other big cities? And perhaps even in the context of vibrant communities, that didn't come out so well. The vibrant movement itself is actually very promising in terms of a potential alliance of groups to try to join together with some of those unusual suspects to try to think about how to engage the provincial government in particular in a strategic conversation about a way forward on this. Alone, you can go fast, but together you can go far. I do not know who said that, but I absolutely adore that that saying, because it does represent the poverty reduction movement in this province, in this country, and it can be something that you can also consider as you look ahead to the great things that need to happen on behalf of people living in poverty. Thank you very much.
Okay, we got about, thank you very much, that was amazing. We got about 10 minutes for questions. If anybody has a question they would like to ask, we have a microphone, and we'll stay away from the microphone.
Hi, Pat Trellick, Whitehawk, and I'm wondering how you handle the regeneration of the working groups as well as some continuity where the balance is, so it's not just this little clique of people working, but you're always growing.
Yeah, maybe you could be a little bit more specific and maybe give me a little bit of context.
A lot of different groups and organizations and momentum grow, and you have the core of the 12 working people there for 35 years. And so the people that want to get involved can't break the circle. But at the same time, some people die, some people graduate. So how do you keep it renewing and bringing them up to speed with what you've grown through?
All right. There's too much work, there's too much work in the poverty reduction file for just a limited number of people to do. There's too much work to do. So the question is, I would say, how can you get organized, perhaps thematically, to create spaces for others to be involved? This has an enormously ambitious vision, and tasking people to start working perhaps either just locally, but hopefully across localities with others in the areas of transportation. I mean, transportation is a big one in New Brunswick as well. Community transport is one of the main themes of these community organizations. So how can you get to the social assistance office if you live in a rural community? How can you get to the clinic? I mean, we need those things. And, you know, having the social assistance office pay for taxi fare doesn't usually work all the time. So creating creative methods of community transportation locally through dial-a-ride types of programs, or through knocking on the education department's door and saying, we want to use your bus. It's not your bus, by the way, it's the community's bus. We like to use it. We have a driver who's going to volunteer. We'll take care of the insurance. That's something like a local transportation committee could work on. So create those places, as I say, thematically, or it could be demographically, a youth group which could advise on youth-related matters. It's only limited by your creativity, how you engage people, I would put to you.
I think there's another question at the back.
Hi, thank you. I was wondering how you were able to create or account for social inclusion of sort of what you mentioned, sort of bad guys or people that use substances, as they are often excluded from this kind of work. And what we know is that stealing cars is often a means to an end, and it's extremely difficult to stop or reduce using drugs when they help to keep you warm and not feeling the feelings of hunger and despair. So I was wondering if sort of another section of poverty that people often live in that's often not included in these conversations. So I was wondering if there was something that you did to address that. Thank you.
Well, health was a huge component of the of the plan. So I'm not sure if that quite gets at it, but yes, the substance abuse, the addiction issues, the mental health issues, that is almost synonymous with poverty reduction. If you can take care of through the kind of ACT teams, supported employment, those alternatives to people being left by themselves to have to fend for themselves using shelters and putting their hand out, then I think you've got that alternative pathway that they need. Right? I mean, you're right. I mean, right now, why do people steal cars? There's going to be a whole bunch of different reasons for that, but often there's because there's no alternatives. Often because they're kind of all alone in a dark hole without a flashlight. So who's going to be accompanying them on the journey to being included if they're all by themselves? People with addictions often are isolated. So who's going to be going into those homes, talking to those people, and actually pulling them into a more mainstream conversation? I mean, it's a very tough answer, but the answers are right there in their homes and in their communities, I would put to you.
Hi, I'm Susan Keeping. I'll just talk like this. I can talk loud. I'm Susan Keeping, and I've been part of Vibrant Surrey since it started, and with many of the people in this room, I think you're aware of that. Vibrant Surrey was started because of the Vibrant Communities Initiative, and they came to our community and inspired us to do something. They also had some seed dollars for a number of years. And so right now we're at a precipice where we're trying to figure out, does Vibrant Surrey continue? But when I hear your presentation and I hear how something like that needs to be done through an organization that helps the community work together at all levels, the business community, all levels of government, I feel inspired by that. I do want to answer the question that somebody brought up about how to engage people who are multiple barrier, the complex issues, who are living in poverty. And some of the Vibrant Communities Inspired projects that we've done locally here, what we've done is we came up with honorariums. We brought them to the table with people who are being paid to be there, and we needed to honor their time. So we came up with participation expenses or honorariums so that we actually paid them for their expertise, because they are the experts. I also wanted to have a question for you, is how much money annually was there provincial government funding, or was it a mixture of funding, and how much?
Yeah, a really good point about engaging excluded people in what's supposed to be an inclusive process, and we did that reasonably well. We could have done it better for sure, but one of the things we did do is go where the people were, because a lot of, if you set up these engagement roundtable type of environments, some people are not really comfortable with that. So sometimes, just to echo what you've said, go to where they are, and if you can provide an honorarium, even better. So I think that's a really nice and better answer than I gave to the question that was asked. With respect to the allocations of provincial government, the provincial government, so it provided money to the Inclusion Corporation, the ESIC, the Economic and Social Inclusion Corporation, and line item that budget through the department that I was running. So we would actually write the check for, it's like $3 or $4 or $5 million a year, which included their staffing, but it also included their programming dollars within the envelope. It ended up being significantly more than that when you think about some of the initiatives I talk about, which were government's responsibility, vision and dental programming, social assistance reform, increasing in minimum wage, and so on. There was all kinds of other dollars and other pots that were going into the plan, but in terms of direct dollars to ESIC and through the community, the area was about $3, $4, or $5 million.
Per year?
Per year.
I think we got time for one more question. One more question.
Okay. Hi, I'm Trish Garner with the BC Poverty Reduction Coalition, and we're a broad-based coalition calling for a poverty reduction plan for BC at the provincial level. So I just wanted to first say thank you so much, James, for your talk. It was really informative, very inspiring for us as a coalition and as a group today. My question is,
we have about 400 organizations around the province. So I think we have the community side of sharing the weight of poverty reduction. We're making inroads in the business side, especially in Surrey. Surrey Board of Trade has been a leader in that respect. But when we go to the government and ask them to take their share, that's where we run into a few barriers. And one of them is, their response is, we think the answer to poverty is to create jobs and grow the economy, and things will trickle down from there. Not recognizing that in BC, actually, most of our people are already working. So I'm just wondering if you encountered that within internal government, and what your response was in relation to that jobs argument there.
No, it's a classic response, and not unpredictable, but it's a limited vision. I mean, it's not wrong, right? I mean, it's creating jobs, hopefully well-paying jobs, is part of poverty reduction, absolutely, but it's a very small part of poverty reduction. I wouldn't say a very small part. It's a part of poverty reduction. So the conversation just has to be, well, what about everything else you're doing? What are your targets in terms of poverty reduction over the next 5 years through job creation? What is that going to bring? You've got a lot of people in your finance department. Tell us what that's going to bring based on your projections. Now tell us what you're going to do in terms of training people to be part of the economy that can take the jobs that are going unfilled. What's your plan for that? That's part of poverty reduction too. And then on and on and on from there, right? It's actually probably not me who's best to answer the question on what is the right tone, what is the right messaging. Now you have someone here from the legislature who would be much better placed to answer, how do we make the provincial government a proud partner in something that will benefit us all?